Hey everybody, Steve again. I just wanted you to know that I haven't disappeared totally, and I'm still kind of plugged in. Bob's been sending me some videos. I just watched one of some classical music being played that was really nice. So I know you guys are doing your thing, starting to work on your variety show kind of performance. And I know that today and tomorrow, at least, we're supposed to be sort of reflection days. Chances for you to kind of think about the learning you've been experiencing, and think about the performance that you're kind of building, and kind of being critical of yourself, of your fellow performers, but in the most positive way. By critical, I mean finding ways you can do better. And so as you're reflecting on all this, I've been reflecting on all this a lot too. I have to say the session the other day was a little odd for me. Odd only in the sense that, we wanted you guys to kind of come up with everything and figure things out, which is a tall order, by the way. There are people whose job is creating effective, powerful learning experiences. So people have, put in a lot of work and effort and expertise learning some of the factors that are relevant, and we just throw you guys right into it, right? Hey, off you go. But from my perspective, the difficulty was shutting up. I'm not real good at shutting up. That's why I become a professor. That's why I'm a lead singer in a band. I like to be up front, like to be in the spotlight. So with that in mind, I just wanted to give your minds a little something to chew on. I wanted to share with you a little bit of expertise that hopefully can combine with you're there. You're experiencing the learning in a way that none of us can. So I know a lot about what experts say about learning and some of the issues. You guys actually have the experience. And so the exciting thing for me is that we can bring these things together, that we can get a sense from you guys whether there's any merit to some of the other things we're doing, and where you might take it. Okay, so really then, there's just 4 things I want to quickly talk to you about and get you thinking about. Here's the first one. And a lot of these come from our discussions yesterday and from me reflecting on it. So I want to talk a little bit about the distinction between subjective versus objective measures of learning. Because literally in the session the other day, I felt that things were going in a really good way, and then from my very idiosyncratic perspective, they veered a wrong way. And I had trouble putting into words why. So I'm going to try to do that now, okay? So not now, in a second. So we're going to talk about this distinction between subjective and objective measures of learning. I want to talk to you a little bit more about assessment itself and the role it plays, because a lot of us who are interested in changing education are looking at assessment. And I want to explain to you why, and I want to get you guys thinking about assessment in maybe a deeper way than you have. Specifically, tying these things together, I want you to start thinking about how you could objectively measure subjective experiences. So I'm going to connect to that comment that was made that said art is subjective. What's good art? What one person thinks is good art, another person might not think is good art. Does that mean you just cannot measure quality in a field like the arts? I'm going to tell you why that's not a good answer, in my opinion. Why measurement is important, and how I think we can objectively measure subjective experiences. And the final thing I'm going to bring into this is peer assessment. Peer assessment is kind of my thing. We didn't get into it too much in the session, and we were hoping you would actually experience it this week, but it's just we're asking too much of you, and so we ended up thinking, wow, it was just going to add stress and pressure and timelines. And so we ultimately didn't have you do peer assessment. But I want to bring it up again because one of the teachers from Holland said to me, well, why don't we have the students assess their own work, and why don't we have teachers assess their work? And I thought, okay, those are 2 of the 3 things I like. It's missing the 3rd thing that I really like, which is having students assess each other's work. That's called peer assessment. And I think it's critical. I think it's critical to learning, and I think I'm going to use an analogy of developing an ear as a musician to make that case. Okay, so let's go through these 4 things. I'm going to try to be quick. I want to start you with therapy. This will explain to you why I'm not comfortable with purely subjective measures of learning. Okay, so back in the day when people started doing therapy, especially Freud, he would spend literally hours with every patient, sometimes years and years of this patient coming in and discussing issues. And, Freud had this theory about how he thought he could help them by talking through all this stuff. And at some point, the scientists in psychology said, oh, come on, guys. How do you know that what you're doing is helping your patients at all? You're taking a bunch of their time. You're taking a bunch of their money. How do you know you're actually helping them? In the medical sciences, we kind of know, right? If someone has a broken arm and you put it in a cast and do stuff, and then 6 months later they can use their arm perfectly well, that treatment helped. How do you know in when it comes to psychological therapy? The answer for many years was the patients tell us they feel better. So this is a subjective self-report measure, I'll call it. The patients say, this is helping me, I feel better. To the scientists, this was not enough. The idea was there's 50 million reasons why somebody might say they feel better. For example, they've just wasted hours of their time and a lot of money spending time with you. If they're not feeling better, then they have to accept that they're kind of doing a stupid thing, and humans don't like being stupid. So probably they're going to say they feel better even if they don't feel better. What we want is some external objective thing we can measure so that we can actually show the therapy is having a positive effect on their life. So give me some aspect of their behavior that we can measure in some quantitative way and show me that therapy improves that measure. And in fact, that is where therapies have gone now. They've become much more scientific. They do measure the symptoms of the disease, and they do measure their ability to affect those symptoms, to reduce the negative symptoms of the disease. Okay, so at the end of the session the other day, the impression kind of seemed to be, well, how do we know if this was a good learning experience? Well, we'll have every student define their learning goals. We will then have the student reflect on their learning goals partway through. And at the end, we will ask them, do you feel like you achieved your learning goals? Are there other things? This is a lot like the therapy, right? If we put a student through this educational experience and at the end of it say, do you think you learned anything? I guarantee you most students are going to say yes. And they're not just going to say yes externally, they're going to believe it. They invested time, energy. And so they will, yes is almost the only answer there. But again, we would like something more. Now, let me give you a little bit of this story because I sometimes love contextualizing things. When you're being taught, when you're in school, who's paying for your education? Well, every taxpayer in your country is paying for your education. Why? Well, for two reasons. One, they believe that this is just a social, moral, ethical thing to do, that every human being has a right to education. Many of them, got an education, and so it's partly a moral thing, but it's also the notion that if you have a well-educated citizenry, then your country is likely to become more powerful. You're going to have more innovation, more interesting things going on, and hopefully more rational. Hopefully you'll behave in a more rational way. So it's good for the country to invest in its future leaders, invest in your development. And so a lot of taxpayers, whether they have children or not, are investing in the education of the children of the country. Okay. Now, given their investing, it's pretty reasonable for them to want to some measure. We're back to the therapy thing. Are students truly getting the education they need? And how can we tell? So this is kind of quality control. And to some extent, educators have a love-hate with quality control. We all understand that we want to be guided by data. We want to be guided by evidence. We want to do things that work. And in order to know what works, we have to figure out how to measure those things. And we have to find out a reliable way we can measure those things. And if we can, and then we can show as a child, let's say creativity, as a child goes through certain experiences, we see their creativity enhanced. Well, that makes us feel really good. And maybe we try different things and we find this enhances creativity more than that. And so then we want to do more of this, right? And so being able to measure something in an objective way increases our ability to do things. Let me just kill this. Sorry. The joys of working at home. All right. If it would stop. Okay, I think she stopped. Okay. Now, here's the trick. What sometimes happens here is we end up measuring things that are easy to measure rather. My goodness, sorry. So sometimes we end up measuring the wrong things. So we measure, I'll just say it. In most cases now, we measure how much information we can stick into your heads, how much you can retain. So we give you tests to see if you're getting the information that we want you to learn. But in many areas, even not in the arts, education is not all about information. It's about things like critical thinking and communication, your ability to learn from feedback, all these other things ultimately determine how successful you are. That's the real kind of success stuff, but they're hard to measure. Content is easy to measure. And so too much, because it's easy to measure, we're driven around by these PISA scores. So what this means is we have to get better at measuring the things that matter. But that seems to be tricky, right? How do you measure learning? And, especially when it comes to the arts. So now let me talk about assessment a little bit, and we're going to bring it all together. You probably think of assessment in a relatively traditional way, which is this. You've experienced some learning episode, so maybe you had a class where a teacher told you about, let's say World War II history, maybe you read some things in a book, and then ultimately we give you a test. And the idea is that test will measure how much of that learning stuck, right? So we do the learning in one situation, and then the assessment is just to measure the learning. That's the sort of traditional view, right? Tests are used to measure learning. But here's what people have pointed out lately. We know that students are having trouble learning because they're often bored, they're often disengaged, they're not paying attention, but that's not true when marks are on the line, okay? When you're being assessed, that's typically when our attention is the most strongly focused. We are engaged. Therefore, it's not surprising that there's been a bunch of studies that show that students are learning a lot when they're being assessed. In fact, they often learn more by testing themselves than they do by studying more. So assessment itself produces learning. And in fact, if you configure it well, you can really maximize this power of assessment. On the right here, you see a goal of the future. So people have talked about this traditional way as assessment of learning. You're assessing learning that happened earlier. But now people are starting to say, no, we should use assessment intentionally to produce learning, or maybe even as the learning experience itself. The assessment is where the learning is happening. Students are engaged, they're interested, they want to know how to do better, how to get better marks. So let's use that context. Let's use assessment as a learning situation. That's something I buy into very much. Okay, so where have we gone though? We've said, okay, we don't like these perceptions of learning too much. I mean, they're fine, but as an ultimate system where you can somehow, give students good feedback on where they are in their learning, we would like something more than student perceptions of learning. Can we measure these things? Well, we know that the process of measuring, assessing, is itself a learning situation. So where can we take all this? Well, if we could objectively measure subjective experience for things that matter, we would be getting there. Let me go back to that comment. The arts are subjective. Some people love punk rock. Some people think it's just a bunch of noise. That's true. Could you get at that? Could you figure out how many people like something and how many people find it noisy? When we were talking about this, and when the person was actually trying to make that point that you cannot measure something in the arts, they said, some people feel something when they experience an art, and other people don't. Well, we can ask them about that, right? We can say, did this experience? So we're now taking the audience perspective, right? We're not doing self-perceptions now. There's what the student thinks, but we could ask an observer of the art questions about what that art evoked and how reliably it evoked what it evoked. And so if you could get at the components, if you can think about what do we mean by quality in this area, it's not just about whether the student thinks they learned something, they've produced something. And surely we can start to decompose what makes things of that sort, be they music, be they drama, be they whatever, good or not. And we can try to zero in on it, and we can arrive at a rubric that can be used to both guide student learning and to provide relevant feedback. So let me just jump. Is this the one? This isn't the one. Yeah, it is the one I want to give you here. I'm not going to go in the arts. I'm going to go somewhere else here. When I use the technology I like, Peer Scholar, one of the things I have students do is give feedback to one another. I want them to learn that process of giving feedback. But what's good feedback? How do you define? If somebody gave you feedback and I have to ask you, was that good feedback or not? Can you break that down? We've broken it down into sort of two things. These are the two questions we usually ask. The top one, how useful? So the student gets this feedback. They are now the audience of the feedback, right? And you're asking the student, this person just suggested, here are some things you could do differently that would make your work better. Did you see anything in what they said that was useful? And how useful was it? So we could start to ask them about usefulness. The other thing I want students to learn when they're giving feedback is that emotional tone matters. You want to tell somebody something useful, but you also need to tell them it in a way that motivates them to listen. I mentioned a little bit about this in the talk. When people criticize us, the lay term is called defensive. We get defensive. What that literally means is that our body goes into defense mode. It's being attacked. Our brain thinks it's being attacked, and we have that fight or flee mentality. But you can't fight or flee. You're supposed to sit, listen, and learn, which is very different and involves your frontal lobes, whereas your fight or flee shuts those down. All right, it's like your fight or flee says, this is not a time for thinking, this is a time for acting. But in the case of feedback, I want them to think. So I want students to learn about the emotions their communication produces. So when students are assessing the feedback they got, they're assessing how useful it is, but then I also give them this a question. What emotion did you feel when you read this peer's work? And when they click on that question, they get a list and they can check all that apply. Okay, so they can say, I felt depressed and frustrated. Okay, so let's say I now have given 4 of my peers feedback, and they all write back to me. I get to see their ratings at the end, and every one of them says I made them angry or depressed or frustrated. Wow. Okay, my feedback, no matter how much goodness there might have been in the comments, it's not going to be very effective because I'm creating the wrong emotional response in my listener, right? It also allows, by the way, the receiver of the feedback to think about the emotionality that produces and to try to set it aside. Here's the more important point. We've taken something like feedback that's kind of a subjective thing. How good is a person's feedback? And we've started to decompose it into things that an assessor can look at and measure. And also things, by the way, that when I tell my students, when you give the feedback, you will be assessed on these things, how useful and your emotional production that you produce. That makes them think about that. And that may help guide them when they're writing their feedback to get the tone right and to worry about how useful their comments are. So we started to go down this line. We started to say, okay, there's the feelings that an art produces. I'm sure there's a bunch of other things we could talk about when it comes to art being effective or not. And start to decompose these things. And these are things that we could then assess, perhaps in a quantitative way. In fact, I wanted to show you something here, and I may have to skip out of here. I am going to skip out of here for a second. While I was creating this, I was creating a bunch of stuff here. Oh, these are my Dutch thank yous at the end. But I searched for rubric arts. Grading rubric, sure. So you can play with things like this, and you can see how people have tried to do this for the artwork. And, you know, these seem to be the things that keep coming up over and over again. So this seems to be the stuff they like in this field. I don't know how well you can see this, but I'm just going to read these categories. So this is just like from really good to not so good. But then they identify 4 aspects of something they consider important for art. And I think here, well, this looks like ceramics that they're producing. But anyway, there's the craftsmanship, so the actual technical skill in producing that art. There's the creativity, so how unique is the art form? Is it just basically a copying of somebody else's work, or is there something very unique in this art form? Production effort. This one is more about did the artist put in a lot of time and effort and seem to really conscientiously work on forming their art, or did they just throw it together in a sort of haphazard way? So that's more about the process than the product, I think, but still potentially relevant. And then similarly at the end, work habits and attitude. Again, more about the process, but how they kind of approach things. You know what they don't have here is that point raised in our talk, which was the feeling that art produces. I think that's critical. There was a rubric that one of the Dutch teachers showed, that, and maybe she can share with you, that had a whole bunch of other categories of art. And one of them was what we call goose pimples, and I think is the Dutch translation to English. But we usually would say the hair goes up on the back of our necks, or something gives us the chills and we get the goosebumps on our arms. You know, did that art form do that for us? To what extent did it do that? That's a cool thing. That's not even captured here. But I think you do get the idea, if I go back to this now. You do get the idea that you can try to capture these subjective things in component ways. And so now you could, you know, for example, the feedback that a student's getting might be feedback that says, you know what, you have a lot of technical skill, but your creativity is low relative to some of your peers. And you have other peers who are very creative. Their technical skills are not as good. So now you're starting to get, you know, feedback that you can use, feedback that is what we call formative, where you think, okay, creativity, well, maybe next time I want to focus a little bit more on being creative, and I want to see how that goes. And then I hope to see my creativity score increase. You know, this is the sort of way we want to get the education system, I think, going, where things like creativity and industriousness and conscientiousness are recognized, measured, and rewarded. Okay. Last bit I want to talk about, and that's peer assessment. This is my thing, so it's not going to surprise anyone to find out I think this is important. But here it goes. When you're learning music, and in my case I was learning guitar, learning where to put my fingers on the guitar neck. And nowadays when you learn, you can look up a song and it gives you the tab and it tells you exactly where to put your fingers on the neck. Back in the day, if I had learned when I was 16 instead of when I was 36, that's about when I started learning, they didn't have tab for every song you wanted. You couldn't just get something that showed you exactly where to put your fingers. What you had to do is listen to the music and experiment and kind of find these things. But what that made you do is that first part: listen to other music, listen to the sorts of patterns, listen to the things they do that make a musical piece good or bad. So by attending to the music of others, like for example those goose pimples, every now and then music does produce that emotionality in us. Why? Like, what song does that for you? And what is it about that song that does that? And if you can learn, if you can figure out, oh, you know what it was, you know, the gravelness in the voice, you can hear the emotion in the person's voice and they're talking about being hurt, and that's what drew me in. Well, maybe if I ever want to draw somebody in to my song, then I should grab that, okay? So you learn to listen to others, and that gives you a sense of the goals you have, the things that you also want to do. So it's an interplay between producing music and actually listening and evaluating the work of others. Pure evaluation. So again, one of the teachers at the end said, oh, we could have the students evaluate themselves and we could have the experts evaluate them. I want the students to evaluate each other. I want you to look at your peers' pieces and say, how creative was that? How technically proficient was that? Did that give me chills? If not, what might they do differently? Okay? And by looking at the work of others and learning from the work of others, you are developing your ear for creativity, or your ear for technical proficiency, or your ear for emotional connectiveness, if you want. And I think that is really critical to the learning process. If I can't hear the difference between B.B. King playing a note on guitar versus, I don't know, Joe down the street, B.B. King has vibrato and how he holds the note, and it's the feel that produces the emotion. And by listening to B.B. King, I am learning, okay, that's what I need to do more of. Okay, so I think that's the role peer assessment plays. And I would love, when you guys are reflecting on your own learning, absolutely reflect on your own learning and what you got out of it. But also, I would love you to try giving each other constructive feedback. And not just saying, wow, that's great. Tell each other something you think they could do that would make what they're doing even better. In order to do that, you're going to have to listen to them very carefully. You're going to have to listen to them very critically. Or watch them, or whatever their art form may be. It's going to take some work on your part. That's usually what your teachers do. But in fact, there's great value because they're employing critical thought. They're trying to understand how to communicate this well to the students in ways that enhances their learning. What I'm suggesting is if you did more of what your teachers are doing, you would learn a lot from that experience, and that would help you be a better producer of art. Okay. Just some food for thought. I never really did this well last time, which is both to thank you, but we're not done. We're going to see each other Friday. But I also wanted to give you guys contact information, and you can use this through the week. If any of you guys want to email me at any time, feel free. This is just other things you can go to learn more. The Alt Lab is my research lab, so you can learn more about that. And by the way, you teachers, if anybody wants to do some collaborative research, especially on peer assessment, but on other things, I would love to hear from you. Let's talk. Vision.peerscholar.com is the website that really explains Peer Scholar, and it really ties together a lot of what I just talked about today. It's a technology that supports this kind of learning. Cool, that I agree in, that I believe in. All right, that's all I got. Sorry that I kind of went into lecture mode. It is sort of what I do, I'm afraid. But I hope it, again, gave you a good sense of some things to think about. And very quickly, again, it's just that notion of the importance of measurement, but also the importance of measuring the important things. So if we want to measure art, we have to figure out what are the components of art that are worthy of measurement and capturing in a rubric. And so I think that's a really important part of all this. So if you guys could think about that, how should we be assessed? What are the elements that define quality? I would love to hear you guys' perceptions of that, what you guys think those elements would be. And yeah, you've got a little bit more of my notion of where things like peer assessment fit in, and you know what we have to do to make the education system better, I think. Okay, cool. I will shut up there. I hope you guys are having a great week. Peace out. See you Friday. Oh, and bummer our band couldn't play with you guys. I was looking forward to that so much. Next trip, we will do that for sure. All right. Bye-bye.